Well, this is some rambling memories of mine. Without sounding too much like an obituary, I'm going to try to recall some of the things about my own life. I was born on October 25th, 1930, in the Calais City Hospital in Maine. Early on, there were trips to visit my mother's family in Miami, Florida, before I can remember. I'm told that I was about the same age as the kidnapped son of the famous aviator Lindbergh. A big manhunt or baby hunt was going on when we were traveling on one of these car trips, and my parents feared they might be stopped and interrogated and even lose their baby boy. My only early memory was probably at about 3 or 4 years of age, and walking from our home at that time, probably a rental apartment, on the St. Croix River. This was across the road from the Customs Immigration Office, since the river separates Maine and the United States from St. Stephen's, New Brunswick, and Canada. I'm sure I was closely accompanied, but I recall walking toward the river on the docks. I'm told I call them as going down in the gonks. I guess I got the consonants a little mixed up there. Most of my memories were anchored around the home my folks bought and moved to when I was about 4 years old. The address was 45 Lafayette Street in Calais. The house had a veranda or porch across the front, which was about 8 feet deep and had a closed wooden wall about 2.5 to close to 3 feet high, with pillars from the top of this to the porch roof. This made a great place to play. There were 3 or 4 wooden steps leading down to a concrete walkway dividing the front lawn, and on down to a gravel sidewalk. That concrete walkway was part of a problem where 4 or 5 years later my sister slipped on the ice and fell on that walkway, breaking a leg. I'd probably tumbled down it a number of times, but she, I guess, was a bit more fragile. At any rate, I seem to be able to take things a little better. The sidewalk had a wooden plank walk going toward the road over a ditch. That would be pretty scary and deep to me for the next few years, until I grew up enough to wade in it in my gum rubber boots. These were special boots that allowed you to get into the snow and slush and water pretty deep, almost up to your knees. In the winter, I'd sometimes try to break through the ice on this ditch and go in really deep. I thought maybe halfway up to my knees. That must have been less than 10 inches deep. But that's how it goes with memories. On the right half of the front lawn was a huge tree called a balm of Gilead, B-A-L-M of G-I-L-E-A-D. It's an unusual tree. The name, too, You can imagine how I butchered that name. We ran it all together, Bomagia. It was big enough to hide behind when cars were coming up the street. A favorite activity of running and hiding seemed to be a main trick, M-A-I-N-E. Pedestrians, though, I was happy to see, greeted and chatted with them. On the left side of this front lawn, my dad planted a small maple tree. That grew faster than I did. On that same left side, there was a drop-off into the garden where I tried skiing a couple of years later. It seemed like a hill to me then, but I've seen it since as an adult and estimate the drop of about probably 2 feet. The skis were simple with just loops of leather to push your rubber boots into. To the right of the front lawn and alongside the house ran our gravel driveway to a 2-car wooden garage well past the house in the back. The right half of the garage contained all manner of tools and equipment and a small workbench against the back wall. Recalling the place brings to mind things I did in our yard as I grew older. For instance, the drive was always wet in the spring of the year and great to play marbles in. I was probably 8 to 12 range of age, and my sister 4 years younger. We neighbor kids would meet in the driveway to play several kinds of marbles. The first type of game where you would stand and shoot. One would toss a marble or a glassy out from a line in the mud for the next kid to shoot at. If it was hit, it was his marble. If missed, then turn came for another sharpshooter to fire at either of the other two, and so on in turn, each standing upright where his marble landed. The second game was to draw a large circle in the mud, probably 3 foot diameter, toss in the marbles, and then take turns snapping another marble from the edge of the circle, trying to hit and capture one or more in the center. But the best game was to grind a heel in the wet gravel and create a bowl, then stand well back, maybe 15 feet, and toss toward the bowl. And then we would take turns flipping our marbles toward the bowl. I've forgotten just how you win, but it was lots of fun and lots of muddy knees. The garage doors were opened side by side, and there was a padlock on them. One winter, I must have been aged 8 to 10. I couldn't get the key to unlock it with my mittens on, so I took them off. One damp finger froze stuck to this padlock, and to try to release it, I reflexly licked it with the tip of my tongue, which, of course, stuck also. Again, my reflex was to yank away, clearing off a layer of cells from both my tongue and my finger. Lesson learned. My only sibling was my sister Janet, 4 years and a couple of months younger, and she was a great buddy. She was very smart, so I taught her lots of games of cards and board games and imaginary stuff involving snow caves in the winter and tenting out in the summer. We had a nice widow lady next door who played parcheesi with us, and she was very competitive too. Monopoly was one of our favorites, but it took so long that we'd have to leave it set up on a card table behind the door in my bedroom and come back to it another time. Janet reminds me how we strung wires from our adjacent bedrooms down the hall between two Morse code sender receiver sets to communicate after we were supposed to be in bed. Our family never acquired things without a long period of wishing for it. My peers got bicycles before I did. Dad and I looked through catalogs for months, it seemed. He and his two brothers rotated evening duty at the Peterson brothers' garage, keeping it open for gas from the pumps out front and occasionally a car sales customer. When things were slow, he'd phone home, and we'd talk quite a bit. On the phone at home, I'd talk to him at work, and the bike was a favorite subject. I still have a drawing that Dad made while he was talking to me. It shows a boy, almost stick figure style, on a bike, and under it the quote, "Good boy dash bike, bad boy dash no bike," end quotes. I must have passed the test as we chose a big bike with knee action shock absorbers and pointed rubber grips, a central panel to hold multiple batteries for a horn and a big headlight and a tail light. But when would I get it? Not my birthday or Christmas. Winter was no time for a bike. So it was later the next spring. I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and it was ordered, and Dad phoned from the garage that the bike had arrived in a big delivery truck. To be sure of prompt and precise delivery, he got in his car and led the truck up Lafayette Street with me and Janet and Mom out in the yard waiting. All we lacked was a fanfare. Wild with excitement, we unpacked the bike. It was huge. It was high. It had a wide seat. I didn't know how to ride a bike, but that didn't stop me. I used an upside-down closed wash tub to climb up on it in the top part of the back lawn. I would push off and ride down the lawn, across the drive, onto the lawn behind the house, and then just short of the garden, I'd just jump off. That was kind of hard on the pointed tipped handlebar grips. It took a few of these runs till I got it, and used the brakes to stop, tilt over, and into a controlled landing. That bike got years of use, but I always had to work harder to keep it up with my friends on their lighter weight Sears Roebuck models. I used it later to deliver newspapers on a route I shared with older friends. I even took it to college with me. Which brings us to a changeover. We'll talk about academic years. There wasn't any kindergarten, but the first grade was in Maine, and I remember the teacher's name was Mrs. Spaulding, or Miss Spaulding. No, it wasn't Spaulding, it was Sperling. There we go. Well, I remembered her as an old lady with long dress way down to her ankles. She, I guess she was a spinster lady. And I thought she must be ancient, but probably she was in her 30s. She was very nice. My first day at school was pretty traumatic, though, and I guess I didn't want to stay. So it wasn't until the second day of school that I really settled in. So I'm told. I just remember it was pretty anxiety-producing at first. The second grade teacher was, I've forgotten her name, but my mom tells me that on one of her parent-teacher meetings, she said that I was very bright, but never would set the world on fire with speed. That shows up in my life a number of ways. That second year was in, a lot of it was in Florida. The third year was in Maine. Her name was Mrs. Murdoch. And I remember third graders were really supposed to be something special. We had moved upstairs in the building, and this made us upperclassmen. The fourth grade teacher was Mrs. Hall. She was a terror. She would wear high heels with must have been spikes in them, I thought, because she was a terror coming down the aisle, and she would just pound down there and pop somebody on the, maybe on the head who wasn't paying attention. That year I had part of it in Maine and a good deal of it in Florida. The fifth year was in Maine. Miss McVeigh. I remember her because this was the first time we had poems, and we would write them and memorize them, and that was about the only type of memory I recall anywhere in my schooling. But I still have a few of those written poems, like Invictus and Village Blacksmith. There was a Florida break for a month or so, and but I didn't enroll in school that year because we weren't going to be there very long. The break was filled in by my dad, where he drilled me in timetables and division. So I got pretty good in that. That was when I discovered that my dad could add 3 or 4 columns of numbers at once, like 320 and 412 make so-and-so. I still can't do that. The sixth year, we rented a place, an apartment in Miami, and I was there, I think, the whole year. I remember nearby, probably a few blocks away, there was a dock on the Biscayne Bay and a bridge going over toward Miami Beach. On both of these, I did some fishing with a friend. And I remember an older relative, I'm not sure how old, but I guess draft age, because he was a conscientious objector. He was a bit strange, but nice. We would fish from the bridge. I remember one time we stopped, and I had a soda and he had coffee, and on the way home he looked at the receipt and it said 2 coffees. And he was very upset. He thought we ought to go back and correct that because I didn't drink coffee and I hadn't had any there, and this was just a terrible mistake. My parents dissuaded him from the return trip, but that's an indication of his conscientiousness. Now, fishing with my dad was never very productive, but that may have been the situation in Maine. But the Uncle Boardman, that would be Aunt Mabel's husband, took me once or twice along with them when they go on a fishing trip in the ocean, and sometimes off of a pier, other times out of a boat. I remember one time we were catching things so fast off of a pier that I grew annoyed with my younger cousin getting in the way of my fishing line while he was trying to fish. Of course, that was Aunt Mabel and Uncle Boardman's son, so there was some readjusting of position there. Back in Maine, again, for the 7th grade, somewhere in there, I took up the cornet, and my teacher was Mr. Phelan, who was the director of the Calais City Band. So very shortly I became a member of that band, and had a very fancy uniform with a bright red and blue cape. And I think, Court has some pictures of me in that outfit with my silver cornet. And I'll come back to my music history as a separate category. And 7th and 8th grade were war times for World War II, so we didn't get to go to Miami, and I was in Calais Academy, which was a public school there in Calais, but there was a fire in that school, and then we had to go by bus to Milltown School. By the time I got to the 9th grade, I had both Maine and Florida with dramatically different attitudes on the part of the teachers and the students, and I think this was probably the effect of the principal in Miami. At any rate, in Maine, the attitudes were such that I was very careful not to let on the grades that I got, which were always A's and honors and so forth. Because if I dwelled on that at all, I might be attacked in a group after school. I remember joining the baseball team, even though I wasn't too hot at it, as some place where I could fellowship with the other guys without having this academic thing come up. And in baseball, they could excel, and that was good. I was just a regular member of the team. No star at all. And I had a smaller friend who was quite good, and he was second baseman, and they put me out in the field. He said that he worked at it so hard because he also was a good student, and being a smaller fellow, he really had to perform on the baseball field to draw attention away from his academic abilities. Now in Miami, everybody was trying to do well academically, and they were very respectful of the ones who achieved. And this was not just the teachers, but the students themselves. And the other attitude was any roughhousing or all was just not accepted at all. I remember being probably ninth grade, and there were some boys from New York who were getting kind of rough in the line waiting for the cafeteria, and an upperclassman just stepped over and took him by the shoulder and said, "We don't do that here." And that was the end of it. And it was a very peaceful environment. Whereas in Maine, there were always scuffles going on. I was bigger than most of the kids in the class, and so that gave me some advantage. Actually, I rather enjoyed wrestling. Or wrestling, perhaps, is a better word, because it wasn't in today's skillful wrestling at all. We'd get out in the back area of the school at recess, or maybe even after school. And there were probably half a dozen of us who really enjoyed this wrestling, and we were all friends, so this was really good fun. The sophomore year, as I said, was back in Florida. The junior year was in Maine, and there baseball, tumbling, jitterbug lessons, and junior prom. I remember the little girl's name was Pat Smith that I took to the prom. She was a neighbor on the next street over, a little blonde, that I stayed in touch with for a number of years. She married an upperclassman after high school, and I remember she worked in the A&P in Calais. And after I was married, even, I'd drop in with my wife and family and give greetings to her and catch up with her pretty successful husband and their lives in the Calais neighborhood. But my real sweetheart was named Doris Kenyon. She was a couple of years younger, and I became friends with her friends, and this was a changeover from mostly classmates. Again, there's some photos in the old albums that show us out at the camp with my mom and dad and sister, maybe a friend or two of hers. She was Roman Catholic, and I remember my dad suggesting that perhaps that wouldn't last. It was nothing very definite, but it was something you're aware of. I worked on the yearbook in my junior year there, and I was in the Civil Air Patrol Cadets. I remember Dad and I climbing the observation tower when I was younger. This was war times, and Dad was an observer, and our job at the top of this observation tower, which had been built for fire observation, but now was converted to identifying any airplanes that were seen and reporting in their type by silhouette identification and their direction of flight. And this was phoned into a central information collecting area and providing some form of intelligence. The senior year was entirely in Florida. My grandmother and Aunt Edith and Uncle Bob had come up by car in the summer, and I went back with them in order to start school at the high school on the first day rather than coming in late as I had often done in the past. On the way south, we swung over to visit Dartmouth, and I was very impressed that this was a beautiful school. And I remember my uncle was in the Air Force at the time, and he had loaned some money to one of his troops. He was an officer, and he decided that he had to get it back, and we drove all the way out to Peterson, which is in Ohio. It was the farthest west I'd ever been. And on the way, we went by Niagara Falls. We had quite a trip. It was really special. I'm not sure whether my uncle got his loan back or not. In Miami, I had the full year in same Miami Senior High School, and I'm a graduate of that school. Band was a big thing, and I'll go into that in my music categories. I did have the advantage of being there the whole year and had a number of very good buddies and girlfriends as well. I was playing trumpet and cornet in the band there at Miami Senior High, and we performed at the Orange Bowl. We're in the Orange Bowl parade, and were a very successful band in the statewide and even southeast competitions, which were a big thing in Florida. And our band always excelled. Zinel has a number of our award pins from those days. I think she has most of the collection of pins and awards and things of that nature from my early years. The band being a large focus was kind of interesting. Back to attitudes, I remember, again, being a very good student, I got excellent grades there in Miami, and they, instead of giving A's and honors, gave actual numbers, and it was the custom that I didn't know about until the first grading period for the band director to announce anyone who had over 90 in their average. And oh my, I began to feel a little of the old Maine attitude of how can I get out of here or sneak under my chair somehow. I knew I had done well. And he said, in this first grading period, I'm very pleased to announce that Greg Peterson had 98.6 average, and the whole band stood up and clapped. Chokes me up even now. But that's, as I said, a heck of a lot different than it was in Maine. where you just didn't want your grades known. And with the focus of the band and its competitions and trips, many of my friends were in the band or the majorettes or the flag twirlers, and we even had an orchestra. The people that I knew best, of course, were some trumpeters, cornet players right next to me. We had a system of challenges for our chair positions where anyone below you could challenge you, and the next morning before school, you and the challenger had to be in front of the band director to play whatever the challenger chose of music we were supposed to know, some of it by heart. The challenger went first, and then you played the same thing. And the band director would decide whether the challenger won and moved into your chair and you dropped back to his or hers, or things stayed the same. So this kept the practicing going pretty firmly, and we were all pretty sharp. I probably reached my music achievement level at that year. As a matter of fact, perhaps, the first chair people in each of the positions, each of the instruments, received an opportunity to have a full scholarship in music at the University of Miami. I didn't take that because you had to major in music, and I was going to be pre-med. The musical abilities in my case went slowly down after that. I'll go into that when we talk about musical exposures. But I mention this because one of my friends I stayed in touch with throughout most of my life, Tom Brody, who died, I guess, a couple of years ago. And he had gone into police work as his older brothers had done, and he'd become a bomb expert in the Miami Police Department. Another one was a girlfriend who was the lead flag twirler. She was about 6 feet tall, and her name was Audrey Christie at the time. And I can't even remember for sure how her last name changed. Maybe it was after she married that she was Audrey Christie. At any rate, I saw her again when I was in college, and then another time after I was stationed in Homestead Air Force Base with my wife and family of 2 boys at the time. She'd had 5 by then. And then we've seen her once. She's in public relations and had to come down from where she lived in Venice, Florida, to some kind of a meeting in Naples, and we got together for lunch, and she met Syl at that time. Those are the only 2 that I've really kept in touch with. Audrey Meyer, that was her first maiden name. She introduced me to one of her flag twirlers that I thought was especially cute. After we had wound down a bit in our own relationship, and this gal's name was Flo, and I can't remember what Florence's last name was, but she was very sweet girl, and I was very attached to her. And my mother must have thought too attached, because I remember thinking as I finished the school year that we would have a special goodbye date. And before that could occur, my mother announced that we were leaving the next morning in the car, and off we went, back to Maine. So there wasn't any discussion of it. It must have just been her method of making sure her her vote carried. I continued to write to this gal through my first year at Dartmouth, and I had her picture on my desk. Most of the guys at Dartmouth, all boys school at that time, had a picture of a girlfriend on their desk. And when I went back in my sophomore year to Christmas vacation in Florida, however, Florence was all involved with somebody else. So it was some other girls that I remembered that I dated on my Christmas vacation, including Audrey Meyer, who was always a good friend. The high school was known as producing maybe over 90% students that went on to college. In Miami at the time, there was another high school that produced primarily people that went into Georgia Tech to become engineers. There was another that was sort of a trade school. They became skilled in the different trades by the time they graduated. And people sent their children to whatever high school they thought their children were destined for, and rather than any geographical disposition of where kids went to school. With that almost prep school attitude, I remember the English class, in particular the teacher, being very supportive of those of us who were applying to college. I applied to Dartmouth because it was so impressive to me on my visit, but I didn't have any high hopes of getting into a Ivy League school. I applied to Duke, which was considered the same category in the South, and then Bowdoin, which is up in Maine. I was accepted in all of them, and I remember the classroom response. The first to receive were three of us that were accepted at Duke, and the whole group of perhaps 30 were just very impressed with us. And then about a week later, I got a telegram from Dad, who was back in Maine, saying that I had been not chosen but selected by Dartmouth for the class of 52. And at the same time, another classmate was chosen by Harvard. And the two of us were kings of the heap. And that's where we chose to go. I met him later in college years a couple of times, and he was very happy with his choice, as I was with mine. Interestingly, there were fitness requirements at Dartmouth, and they mailed us these in the summer, and I practiced standing broad jumps and rope climbing and that sort of thing to make sure I could do it in the required time. The toughest for me was a 100-yard swim. My practicing got me through it, but just barely. The standing broad jump, you had to be able to jump your height, and I was over 6'2", and so I had to practice that quite a bit. But it's interesting what practice will do. The Dartmouth Outing Club had an early arrival trip up there. Mount Katahdin is, no, not Mount Katahdin, Mount Moosilauke in New Hampshire is owned by Dartmouth College, and so they have a lodge at the base, and we went up early for this trip, and it was interesting that we learned that there are no high school letters allowed at Dartmouth, and that we had to memorize and be able to recite any of the Dartmouth cheers and songs. Well, I met my roommate on that trip. It was Tom Fenton, who was also interested in the outdoor aspects of Dartmouth. And his older brothers had gone to Dartmouth ahead of us, and so he knew the tunes of the songs, and so we got prepared for the hazing upperclassmen would stop you on the campus and demand these songs or cheers. At any rate, it was a great climb up the mountain and a lot of good fellowship, and I decided at that time that the Dartmouth Outing Club was definitely going to be important in my years at Dartmouth, and I joined it, as well as the Ledyard Canoe Club, which fit right into my pre-existing experience. And I did a few other things like the yearbook. I was sports editor assistant. Probably the big thing was college band. I'll go into that more when I talk about my music history. I was pre-med and had a minor in chemistry and a minor in Shakespearean English, of all things. Pre-meds, Dartmouth was known for this. So of our 700 plus classmates, I think about 500 of us were pre-med. The dean of the medical school there at Dartmouth, Dr. Sivertson, was my counselor. And it was interesting that by the second year, the end of the first year, that 500 was down to 200. There were always people who had family pressures to go into medicine who weren't really interested, or maybe the academic pressures clarified their minds. The level of competition at Dartmouth was another step beyond high school, of course. And as an example, everybody, all freshmen, had to take Psychology 101. And at the end of this, it was a pretty easy course, I thought. But I guess everyone else did too. So you had to have a 98 to have an A, which I was able to achieve, along with other pre-meds and psych majors. A B was 96 to 97, a C was 95, and a D was 94. Anything less than 94 for the year, you failed. There were very few failures, but that gives you an idea of the pressures. The school had placement exams before we started our freshman year. And I did quite well in physics and was placed up a level, which really was a mistake because it became a very difficult course for me at the higher level of physics. And I did okay, but it was no longer an A course. all freshmen had to take their meals in what was known as the Commons, which was a huge building with a large dining area. And hazing was still going strong in 1948. And we had been routed out of our beds after midnight to the tune of screaming 52 out. I think I recall we'd been assigned little freshman beanies we were supposed to wear to identify ourselves, and I was going to send mine back to my sister. And one night we were routed out, and there was a lot of beer drinking, and a part of the upperclassmen and the sophomores were primarily the hazers, and they dumped a whole lot of beer right onto the floor in our room. And I, half awake, looked out and saw my freshman beanie floating on that, and I could never send that home to my sister. We went out and were paraded up to the Dartmouth Hall and stood there and required to sing the Dartmouth songs. And then it was pretty benign that night, and we went back to our dorms and got back to sleep. But apparently there'd been some resistance, and the sophomores decided they would block the Commons and not let us in for breakfast the next morning. Well, as the number of freshmen arrived for breakfast, these football player lettermen from freshman football began to look more vulnerable as our numbers increased, and we began to pull them off the steps and made our way into the Commons dining room. And this was my first exposure to, I guess you'd call it, rioting. Instead of going in to get our breakfast in any manner of orderliness, the emotional tensions had gotten to the level where the leadership of this mass of freshmen started smashing chairs and throwing tables, and I remember even ripping out the water fountain. So this was not for me. I got out of there without breakfast, went ahead with my placement exams. The freshmen must have succeeded too well, because that night there was a full-blown sophomore attack, not just the lettermen, but it seemed like the whole class was out for vengeance.